So that's all going on in the background. So food production, remember we talked about all the farmers disappeared and all these chemicals are being introduced. Now all the food production is moving out to the Midwest, right? This is a fairly logical progression. Farms on the East Coast disappear, farms move to the Midwest because we still got to eat. Now all we have here on the East Coast are subdivisions, we got no farms, we still have to eat. So just look at what you're looking at here. Corn, wheat, and soybeans all together add up to something like 250, 300 million acres. Now, in addition to the health consequences that we're going to talk about, you have to look at that as a landscape, because as a landscape, those acres are about as ecologically viable as a parking lot. When you grow one thing year after year after year after year after year, I mean, not only have you cut all the trees and everything else down to make them, but now the soil is being depleted, the water is being contaminated. You're dependent, very chemically dependent kind of farming, because you're spraying lots of herbicides and insecticides and using synthetic fertilizers in very large volumes. Now the important thing, this is kind of where we're going back to the very first slide, are GMOs bad for us? Well, I'll let other people argue about the science of genetics. My question, my larger point here is the GMO crops that are being grown in this country essentially for one purpose, which is to prop up that kind of food. Now, I don't think there's any argument about whether that kind of food is bad for our health. So whether eating a genetically altered plant is damaging to your body, eating the food that it is used to make is. So we have, as you well know, national epidemics of obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure and all that. That's because this is the kind of food that we're eating. And all of that is grown out of industrial monoculture GMO grain. So you might look at a hamburger and say, I don't see any GMOs in that picture. Well, the hamburger was made out of cheap industrial beef, and cheap industrial beef is all fed GMO corn. Now, without even getting into the fact that cows did not evolve to eat corn, they evolved to eat grass, right? They're herbivores. They're not supposed to eat corn. But corn is cheaper to grow than having cows grazing on grass. So what we've designed is an industrial system to force feed cows something that they are not evolved to eat. So when cows get sick because they're eating corn instead of grass, we've got to shoot them up with antibiotics and all that. That's a whole nother can of worms. But GMOs are in all that stuff right at its very foundation. All those roads, all those big farms in the middle of the country radically changed the way we make and eat food. So this is the way Americans eat now. We want our food fast and we want it cheap. A very high percentage of American meals are eaten in somebody's car. This is unlike the way human beings have eaten in all of human history and all of human culture. We eat differently. Drive across the US and this is what you will see. For thousands of miles, basically from the East Coast to the Rockies, this is what you see. That is not a natural landscape. That is a highly industrialized landscape. Monoculture perennial crops. I'm sorry, monoculture annual crops. If they were perennial, we'd have fewer problems. I'll get into that later. Think about when you're looking at those crops, what you don't see. You don't see forests. You don't see wildflowers or native plants. You don't see any animals. And you don't actually even see any vegetables. What you see are the building blocks for the industrial, processed, and fast food industries. So when you think about it, going back to the roads, when you build the highways, which then leads to the closing of the farms, now you have to create millions and millions of acres in order to prop up a food system that we already know is demonstrably unhealthy for us. But you also have eviscerated the ecological diversity of this continent. We've also radically shrunk the variety of the kinds of foods that we eat and the kinds of seeds that farmers have to use. So 50, 60, 70 years ago, farmers were planting a much greater diversity of kinds of food than we are now. We have about 10% of the apple varieties that we used to have. One of the reasons is that one of the biggest purchasers of apples is McDonald's, because they like to serve apple slices to convince parents that they're running a healthy food operation. When McDonald's wants Gala or Empire apples, that's what farmers are going to grow, because that's their biggest customer. So now you can see how farmers have to follow the industrial model. When the industrial model wants something at large scale, the farmers will grow it. So one of the solutions to this problem, as we'll get into later, is don't eat there. Eat somewhere that serves a different kind of apple, a local kind of apple. In other words, one thing you can do as someone who feels overwhelmed by these problems is simply put your money where your politics are, like shop locally, shop organically. Keep your money from entering this system in whatever possible way you can. About 40% of all this GMO grain is used to feed the 9 billion animals that Americans eat every year. Now, you've heard other people, and there are plenty of books on the table here, talking about the monstrosity, the moral monstrosity of industrial meat production. I don't even have time to get into it. It is at a scale that is unimaginable and abhorrent, to say the least. So one thing you can do is eat less of that. I mean, if you want to eat meat, at least don't eat that kind of meat. I also am not going to be talking about climate change, but if I were talking about climate change, one of the primary things you can do to lower your carbon use is to eat less meat. That's another thing. It's a very carbon-intensive thing. The other problem here, unfortunately, is that other countries around the world have decided that the American food system is something that they want to emulate. So now, for example, you're seeing China moving very rapidly into a much heavier reliance on meat, on beef. They want to eat beef the way Americans eat beef. This is sort of a status symbol. Now, when you have 300 million Americans eating like this, it's one kind of problem. When you have 1.5 billion Chinese eating like this, it's going to be a whole nother kind of problem. And it's not going to be like they're going to grow beef cattle in China. What they're going to do, and they are doing, is they're going to cut down rainforests in the Amazon so they can raise grain and cattle in Brazil so they can ship the beef to China. So we're talking about like local diets creating global problems. So vast monoculture acres of corn and soybeans require huge amounts of pesticides, which are sold by the same handful of companies that make GMOs. We're talking about a very small number of companies that have a great deal of control over all of this.